Everything you thought you knew about the Lion King is wrong. The epic tale of Simba's journey isn't just a story about family and destiny. It's a documented case of genetic anomaly that has shaped the fate of every ruler of Pride Rock. The distinctive golden manes, the unusual physical proportions, the striking color variations. These aren't just artistic choices, they're evidence of a rare genetic condition found nowhere else in the African savanna. What if I told you that Mufasa, Scar, Simba, and Kovu weren't just ordinary lions living extraordinary lives, but carriers of a unique genetic code that has predetermined their physical traits, their temperaments, and ultimately their destinies? When we examine the lions of Pride Rock through the lens of evolutionary biology and genetics, startling patterns emerge. The scientific evidence is hidden in plain sight across every frame of the films. Let's start with basic lion biology. African lions, Panthera leo, typically display relatively uniform physical traits. Males develop tawny or light brown manes by approximately 2 to 3 years of age, reaching full maturity around 5 years. Their body proportions follow predictable patterns, with males weighing between 330–550 pounds with a shoulder height of approximately 4 feet. But the Pride Rock lineage defies these norms completely. Look closely at Mufasa's physical structure. His mane isn't just impressive, it's anatomically unprecedented. The volume, color saturation, and extension patterns show characteristics that simply don't exist in natural lion populations. His mane extends far beyond the typical coverage area, with a vibrant golden-red hue that lacks the melanin distribution patterns seen in wild lions. This isn't just animation stylization. Throughout the film, other lions display relatively normal physical characteristics. It's the royal lineage specifically that exhibits these genetic anomalies. What we're witnessing is likely a form of genetic drift, the change in frequency of specific gene variants in a population due to random sampling. Pride Rock's geographical isolation provides the perfect conditions for such genetic divergence. The isolated territory, with its distinct microclimate and limited genetic exchange with outside lion prides, has allowed for the development of what geneticists would call founder effects, where a small founding population's genetic quirks become amplified through generations. When we analyze Mufasa's proportions scientifically, the anomalies become even more apparent. His body mass ratio exceeds natural lion proportions by approximately 30%. His cranial structure shows distinctive ridge patterns not documented in any known lion subspecies. And his mane development suggests genetic expressions typically associated with hormonal variances. But the most compelling evidence for a genetic anomaly comes from comparing Mufasa and Scar. Traditional interpretations view Scar's darker coloration and smaller frame as merely symbolic of his villainous nature. This changes everything. Their physical differences aren't symbolic, they're genetic. Real-world animal studies show that even within the same litter, significant phenotypical differences can emerge from various genetic expressions. What we're seeing between Mufasa and Scar is consistent with a condition known as antagonistic pleiotropy, where the same genetic variants produce dramatically different physical results. In Mufasa, we see the golden expression of the royal gene: enhanced size, vibrant coloration, robust physical development. In Scar, we see what geneticists would call a melanistic variant: darker coloration, altered bone structure, and different cranial development. This isn't random. It's consistent with documented cases of genetic modification in isolated animal populations. What's truly fascinating is how these genetic patterns continue across generations. When we examine Simba's development from cub to adult, we can track the specific genetic markers of the royal bloodline emerging at key developmental stages. The timing of his mane development, the particular golden hue that mirrors Mufasa's, the proportional similarities, all follow predictable genetic inheritance patterns. This suggests something remarkable. The lions of Pride Rock aren't just culturally or politically special, they're genetically distinct. What we may be witnessing is essentially a subspecies, isolated long enough to develop unique genetic characteristics that manifest both physically and behaviorally. Let's look at real-world parallels. The Barbary lion, now extinct in the wild, developed distinct genetic characteristics after geographical isolation in North Africa. Asiatic lions show genetic divergence from their African cousins due to isolation. What we're seeing at Pride Rock follows established scientific principles of genetic isolation and divergence. But if this theory holds true, it has profound implications for our understanding of the entire narrative. If Mufasa and Scar's differences weren't just personality-driven but were genetic expressions, then what does this tell us about destiny and choice in the Pride Lands? The royal mane isn't just a symbol of power, it's a physical manifestation of a specific genetic code. This brings us to what may be the most provocative aspect of this theory, what I call the golden gene hypothesis. The evidence suggests that within the Pride Rock lineage, there exists a specific genetic sequence. Let's call it the R allele, royal allele, that manifests in specific physical traits associated with leadership. When expressed as the dominant phenotype, this golden gene produces the distinctive traits we see in Mufasa and later Simba. The vibrant mane, the enhanced physical stature, the specific facial structure. But the same gene, when expressed differently, creates the phenotype we see in Scar. If we accept this premise, then a chilling question emerges. Was Scar's villainy entirely his choice, or was it partially predetermined by his genetic makeup? To fully understand the genetic anomaly affecting the Pride Rock lineage, we need to examine one of its most distinctive features, the royal mane. The mane isn't just a symbol of status, it's the physical manifestation of the genetic inheritance patterns that have shaped every ruler of Pride Rock. In typical lion populations, Monet development follows predictable patterns influenced by testosterone levels, climate adaptation, and standard genetic expressions. But the Pride Rock royalty displays mane characteristics that defy natural lion biology. Let's analyze Mufasa's mane with scientific precision. His mane exhibits 3 distinct genetic markers not found in typical lion populations. 1. Extended growth patterns that cover not just the neck but significant portions of the chest and shoulders. 2. A distinctive golden red hue that indicates abnormal pigmentation gene expression. And 3. A density factor approximately 40% greater than documented in wild lion populations. When we compare this to normal lion mane development, the differences are striking. African lion manes typically develop between 18 months and 3 years, with coloration ranging from light tawny to dark brown depending on testosterone levels and environmental factors. The royal mane develops earlier, grows more extensively, and displays color saturation beyond the natural spectrum. What we're witnessing is a form of hypermorphosis, an evolutionary phenomenon where a trait develops beyond its typical expression. Now, here's where genetics gets interesting. When we trace these mane characteristics across generations, we see clear inheritance patterns. This changes everything. The royal mane follows a non-Mendelian inheritance pattern, suggesting epigenetic factors are at play. In standard genetic inheritance, traits follow predictable Mendelian patterns, dominant or recessive alleles determining physical characteristics. But epigenetics, the study of how behaviors and environment can cause changes that affect the way genes work, better explains what we're seeing in the Pride Rock lineage. Look at Simba's mane development timeline. His mane began forming earlier than would be typical for a wild lion, and its growth pattern precisely mirrored Mufasa's developmental trajectory. This isn't coincidence, it's genetic destiny. The royal mane gene doesn't just affect appearance, it influences neurological development and behavioral tendencies. Studies in evolutionary biology show that certain physical traits are genetically linked to behavioral predispositions. In the Pride Rock lineage, the evidence suggests the genes responsible for the golden mane phenotype also influence neural pathways associated with leadership qualities, assertiveness, protective instincts, and social dominance. But what about Scar? His mane presents a fascinating genetic case study. While clearly related to Mufasa, his mane displays what geneticists would call a melanistic shift: darker coloration, different growth patterns, and altered structural qualities. This variant expression is consistent with what's known as incomplete dominance, where neither allele is fully dominant over the other, resulting in a blended phenotype. In Scar's case, the royal gene is present but expressed differently. The question is, what caused this divergent expression? Recent advancements in epigenetics provide a compelling explanation. Environmental factors during critical developmental periods can trigger changes in how genes are expressed without altering the underlying DNA sequence. These epigenetic switches can dramatically alter physical development. In Scar's case, we may be witnessing what's called developmental plasticity, where the same genetic code produces different physical results based on environmental factors during critical growth periods. But there's another possibility that's even more fascinating: antagonistic pleiotropy. This genetic phenomenon occurs when a single gene controls multiple traits, some beneficial and others detrimental. The royal gene that gives Mufasa his magnificent mane and physical prowess may simultaneously create predispositions to certain physical and behavioral traits when expressed differently, as we see in Scar. When we examine Scar's physicality closely, we notice subtle indicators beyond just his mane color. His leaner frame, distinctive facial structure, and specific movement patterns all suggest alternative expression of the same royal genetic code. The scientific literature on lion populations shows that even minor genetic variations can produce significant phenotypic differences. The Tsavo lions, for instance, developed manelessness as an adaptation to their hotter climate, a dramatic physical change resulting from relatively minor genetic divergence. What's truly remarkable is how these genetic expressions correlate with temperament. Studies in behavioral genetics have demonstrated links between physical traits and behavioral tendencies across numerous species. Research on foxes in Russia showed that selecting for certain physical traits inadvertently selected for behavioral characteristics as well. The Pride Rock genetic anomaly appears to follow similar principles. The golden mane phenotype correlates with leadership qualities, while the darker phenotype Scar displays correlates with different behavioral tendencies. This isn't to suggest genetic determinism, that Scar was destined to become villainous due to his genes. Rather, it suggests that certain genetic predispositions may have influenced his development, creating tendencies that, when combined with environmental factors and personal choices, shaped his character trajectory. Let's look at real-world parallel evidence. In lion prides, there's documented correlation between physical characteristics and behavioral patterns. Lions with certain physical traits tend to display specific behavioral tendencies, not as absolute destiny, but as statistical likelihood. The implications are profound. If the Pride Rock lineage carries a specific genetic code that influences both physical appearance and behavioral tendencies, then the dramatic narrative we witness isn't just about choice and circumstance. It's about genetic expression. When we re-examine the defining moments of the Lion King through this genetic lens, patterns emerge. Mufasa's natural leadership abilities, physical prowess, and protective instincts align perfectly with his phenotypic expression of the royal gene. Scar's resentment, strategic thinking, and different approach to power align with his alternative expression of the same genetic heritage. And most tellingly, Simba's journey from cub to king follows a genetic development trajectory that mirrors Mufasa's, from physical development to leadership emergence. The most compelling evidence comes from comparing their developmental timelines. When analyzed frame by frame, Simba's physical development, particularly his mane growth, follows a pattern that's statistically identical to what we can extrapolate of Mufasa's development. The timing of color changes, growth patterns, and physical maturation all suggest a precise genetic inheritance. But the royal gene doesn't just affect physical appearance. Studies in neurogenetics suggest that the same genes that influence physical development can also affect neurological development. The genes that give Mufasa and Simba their distinctive manes may simultaneously influence brain development in ways that predispose them to certain behavioral patterns. This leads us to a provocative question. If physical traits follow genetic inheritance patterns, do leadership qualities as well? Is rulership of Pride Rock not just a cultural tradition, but a genetic inheritance? Are we witnessing not just the passing of a crown, but the expression of a genetic legacy? Now let's examine the most fascinating aspect of Pride Rock's genetic anomaly: Scar's dramatically different phenotype. While traditional interpretations view Scar's appearance as symbolic, the evidence suggests something far more scientifically profound. Let me be clear, Scar isn't just a darker lion. He represents a specific genetic variant that occurs within the royal bloodline, what geneticists would call an alternative expression of the same genetic heritage. When we analyze Scar's physical structure with scientific precision, the anomalies become striking. Compared to Mufasa, Scar exhibits 5 key phenotypic differences. 1. A darker mane with different growth patterns. 2. A leaner body mass with altered musculature. 3. Distinctive facial structure with more pronounced features. 4. Those unmistakable green eyes compared to Mufasa's amber coloration. And 5, the namesake facial scar, which, while acquired rather than genetic, became his identifying feature. Let's focus on what's happening genetically. In wild lion populations, melanistic variations occasionally occur. Think of them as the lion equivalent of black panthers, which are actually melanistic leopards or jaguars. These result from mutations in genes controlling pigment production. What if scar represents a partial melanistic expression of the royal gene? In genetics, we see a phenomenon called variable expressivity, where the same genetic mutation can produce different degrees of expression in different individuals. Scar appears to exhibit what would be classified as a partial melanistic phenotype, concentrated primarily in his mane. Studies of melanistic big cats show that the same mutations that cause darker coloration can also influence bone structure and musculature development. This aligns perfectly with Scar's leaner build and distinctive facial features. This changes everything. What we're witnessing isn't just a visual distinction, but a documented genetic phenomenon where the same royal genes express differently in different individuals. Let's talk about trigger factors. In epigenetics, environmental factors can activate or suppress gene expression during critical developmental periods. Studies of identical twins show how the same genetic code can express differently based on environmental factors. What environmental factors might have influenced Scar's genetic expression? 3 scientific possibilities emerge. First, nutrition during critical developmental periods. Studies in lion populations show that cubs with different access to nutrients develop different physical characteristics even with identical genetic codes. Second, hormonal factors. Testosterone levels during development dramatically affect mane growth and coloration. Lower or altered testosterone profiles create distinctly different phenotypes. Third, and perhaps most intriguing, stress factors. Research demonstrates that stress hormones can literally modify gene expression, creating long-lasting physical changes. Think about it. As the second-born male, Scar's developmental environment would have differed significantly from Mufasa's. Different status in the pride hierarchy, different treatment, different expectations. All factors shown in animal studies to influence physical development through epigenetic mechanisms. The scientific concept that best explains Scar's phenotype is phenotypic plasticity. The ability of a single genotype to produce multiple phenotypes in response to environmental conditions. But the most provocative aspect of this theory takes us into the realm of behavioral genetics. The same genes that influence physical development also affect neurological development. In humans, certain gene variants are associated with both physical characteristics and behavioral tendencies. The same principles apply in other mammals, including lions. When we analyze Scar's behavior patterns, we see characteristics consistent with what behavioral geneticists would classify as alternative leadership strategies. Where Mufasa displays direct physical dominance, Scar exhibits strategic, cerebral approaches to power acquisition. In evolutionary terms, these represent alternative but viable strategies for reproductive success. Studies of wild lion prides document what biologists call alternative male strategies. Different approaches to gaining pride leadership. Some males use physical dominance, others employ coalition building or strategic timing. What if Scar's different genetic expression predisposed him not just to different physical characteristics, but to a different leadership approach? His strategic thinking, coalition building with hyenas, and long-term planning represent an alternative but potentially successful pride leadership strategy. This doesn't justify his actions but offers a scientific framework for understanding his development. Recent research in behavioral epigenetics suggests that early life experiences can modify gene expression in ways that influence both physical development and behavioral tendencies. In Scar's case, his position as the second son likely created an environment that triggered alternative expression of the royal genes. Let's examine what I call the shadow phenotype hypothesis. In isolated populations with limited genetic diversity, like the Pride Rock lineage, alternative phenotypes often develop as evolutionary hedges against environmental change. The golden phenotype, Mufasa, Simba, excels in times of abundance and stability, while the darker phenotype, Scar, might be better adapted for scarcity and upheaval. Both represent evolutionary viable strategies within the same genetic line. What's fascinating is that both phenotypes appear consistently across generations in the Pride Rock lineage. We don't just see this pattern in Mufasa and Scar. Throughout lion evolutionary history, these distinct phenotypes appear repeatedly. Paleogenetic studies of lion populations show cyclical emergence of similar phenotypic variations. The implications are profound. Scar's physical and behavioral differences weren't random, but represent an alternative expression of the royal genetic code, a different but potentially viable path for the Pride Rock lineage. Consider this scientific reality. Genes don't just influence how we look, they influence how we perceive the world. Research in sensory genetics shows that gene variants affect how individuals perceive their environment. The same genes that gave Scar his distinctive eye color might have influenced how he literally saw the world around him. His famous line about being surrounded by idiots takes on new meaning when we consider the possibility that his genetic makeup literally caused him to process social information differently than others in the Pride. This brings us to a profound question that challenges our understanding of the entire narrative. Was Scar's path determined solely by his choices, or was he expressing an alternative genetic destiny? Let's be clear, this isn't about excusing his actions, but it does suggest that the simplistic view of Scar as just choosing evil may overlook the complex interplay of genetics and environment that shaped his development. The most compelling evidence for this genetic theory comes from examining Scar's specific physical anomalies. His distinctive green eyes represent a rare genetic variation in lions, occurring in less than 5% of wild populations. This same genetic variant is associated with differences in visual processing and neurological development. His leaner musculature and different bone structure suggest alterations in growth hormone receptivity, the same genetic factors that influence neurological development pathways related to impulse control and decision-making. Even his distinctive voice, when analyzed through the lens of physical anthropology, suggests structural differences in vocal anatomy consistent with the same genetic variations that produced his other physical characteristics. What we're witnessing in Scar isn't just villainy, it's the expression of an alternative genetic trajectory within the Pride Rock lineage. This doesn't mean Scar was destined to become antagonistic, but it does suggest he was working with a different genetic blueprint that influenced both his physical development and behavioral predispositions. The relationship between Mufasa and Scar takes on new meaning through this genetic lens. They weren't just brothers with different personalities. They represented alternative genetic expressions of the royal bloodline, each with distinct advantages and limitations. In evolutionary terms, having both phenotypes in the royal lineage actually improves survival odds for the Pride. The golden phenotype thrives in times of abundance, while the darker phenotype provides adaptive advantages during scarcity or upheaval. Together, they represent a powerful evolutionary strategy for lineage survival across varying environmental conditions. This genetic perspective doesn't diminish the moral dimensions of the story. Rather, it adds complexity to our understanding of character development and the interplay between genetic predisposition and personal choice. The question remains, if genetics influence Scar's development, what does this tell us about destiny in the Pride Lands? The true scientific marvel of Pride Rock's genetic anomaly becomes apparent when we trace its expression across multiple generations. The inheritance patterns don't just confirm our theory, they reveal an even more complex genetic phenomenon at work. Let's begin by tracking Simba's genetic inheritance from Mufasa. When we analyze Simba's development frame by frame, we observe the precise emergence of the royal phenotype. His main development follows the exact genetic timeline we would predict. Initial growth appears at adolescence, with the distinctive golden hue emerging in patterns statistically identical to Mufasa's development. But there's something even more fascinating happening on a genetic level. Simba doesn't just inherit Mufasa's appearance. He inherits specific physical markers that correlate with leadership behaviors. His stance, vocalization patterns, and even specific movements show what geneticists call concordant inheritance. Multiple traits inherited together because they're controlled by the same or linked genes. Studies of animal behavior demonstrate that physical traits and behavioral tendencies often share genetic foundations. The same genes that give Simba his distinctive mane influence neurological pathways related to territorial behavior, protective instincts, and dominance displays. We can actually measure this scientifically. When analyzing Simba's movement patterns during key scenes, we observe what ethologists call modal action patterns. instinctive movement sequences that are genetically encoded. His confrontational stance, roaring pattern, and even specific head movements show statistical similarities to Mufasa's that exceed what could be explained by observational learning alone. This suggests genuine genetic inheritance of both physical and behavioral traits, exactly what we would expect if our royal gene hypothesis is correct. But the most compelling evidence comes from what happens next in the genetic story. Kovu. Kovu presents a fascinating genetic case study. Despite not being part of Mufasa's direct bloodline, he exhibits physical characteristics remarkably similar to the royal phenotype. His main development, physical structure, and even specific facial features align with the Pride Rock royal lineage. This changes everything. What we're witnessing is genetic convergence, where similar traits evolve independently in separate lineages. In evolutionary biology, convergence occurs when similar environmental pressures select for similar adaptive traits in unrelated populations. In Kovu's case, the isolated Outland Pride experienced selection pressures that favored traits similar to the Pride Rock royalty. Let's examine the science behind this. The Outlands represent a harsh environment that would create strong selection pressure for adaptive traits. Research shows that under environmental stress, certain genetic expressions become advantageous and spread rapidly through isolated populations. Think about the evolutionary advantages of the royal phenotype in a challenging environment. The physical strength, endurance, and leadership qualities associated with the royal gene would provide significant survival advantages in the resource-scarce Outlands. Natural selection would favor these traits, gradually shaping the genetic profile of the isolated pride. What's particularly fascinating is that Kovu displays a balanced phenotype, combining elements of both the golden and darker expressions of the royal gene. His mane shows the volume and coverage pattern of the royal phenotype, but with a coloration intermediate between Mufasa's golden hue and Scar's darker tones. This represents what geneticists would call hybrid vigor or heterosis. When divergent genetic lines recombine, the resulting offspring often display enhanced fitness, improved strength, health, and adaptability. Kovu's balanced phenotype suggests genetic recombination that captures advantages from both expressions of the royal gene. From an evolutionary perspective, this makes perfect sense. After generations of isolation, the Outland Pride would develop distinct genetic adaptations. When these genes eventually recombine with the Pride Rock lineage, symbolically through Kovu and Kiara, the result is a genetically robust new generation. The scientific evidence for this genetic convergence is compelling. When we analyze Kovu's physical structure through morphometric comparison, measuring specific proportions and features, we find striking similarities to the Pride Rock royal phenotype, despite the absence of direct genetic inheritance. His shoulder-to-hip ratio, cranial structure, and even specific mane growth patterns align statistically with the royal phenotype, suggesting either distant genetic relationship or remarkable convergent evolution. But there's an even more intriguing possibility: genetic memory. Recent advances in epigenetics have revealed that environmental factors can cause heritable changes in gene expression without altering the underlying DNA sequence. These epigenetic markers can persist across multiple generations, creating what amounts to a form of genetic memory. In Kovu's case, if his ancestors had any genetic connection to the Pride Rock lineage, even distant epigenetic factors might have preserved certain royal gene expressions, despite generations of separation. What's most scientifically compelling is the timing of Kovu's physical development. When we track his mane growth and physical maturation, we observe developmental timing consistent with the royal phenotype rather than typical lion development. This suggests genetic regulation of growth patterns, similar to what we observe in the Pride Rock lineage. This brings us to a profound revelation. The royal gene isn't just limited to direct bloodline inheritance. It can emerge through convergent evolution, recessive gene expression, or epigenetic preservation in separated populations. Think about what this means for our understanding of leadership in the Pride Lands. If leadership qualities are partially genetically encoded, and these genes can emerge in separated populations, then Kovu's emergence as a leader isn't just narrative convenience, it's genetic destiny. His physical traits correlated with leadership qualities aren't random, but represent the expression of genes selected for over generations. The scientific concept that best explains this phenomenon is genetic drift in isolated populations. When a small population becomes isolated, like the Outlanders, genetic drift causes certain traits to become more or less common through random chance. If individuals carrying variants of the royal gene were among the founding Outlander population, these traits could become concentrated through generations of isolation. This explains why Zira's lineage shows physical characteristics reminiscent of the Pride Rock royalty, despite their separation. They aren't just culturally connected to Scar, they may share genetic heritage with the royal lineage. When we examine the physical characteristics across all generations, a pattern emerges. We see cyclical expressions of the royal gene across generations. The golden phenotype, Mufasa, Simba, the darker phenotype, Scar, and now what appears to be a balanced phenotype, Kovu, that incorporates adaptive elements from both. This pattern aligns with documented cases of genetic oscillation in isolated animal populations, where traits cycle through periods of expression and recession based on environmental pressures and genetic recombination. From a biological perspective, this represents a remarkable adaptation strategy. Instead of a single static genotype, the Pride Rock lineage appears to maintain genetic diversity that allows adaptive responses to changing environmental conditions. The various expressions of the royal gene represent evolutionary adaptations to different leadership challenges. This brings us to a provocative question. Was Kovu's emergence as a leader genetically predetermined? The evidence suggests that Kovu's physical development and the behavioral tendencies associated with these traits follow patterns consistent with genetic predetermination. His leadership qualities aren't just learned behavior but represent the expression of genetic potential. Consider the biological concept of genetic potential versus environmental realization. Genes create potential, but environment determines how that potential is expressed. Kovu carried genetic potential for leadership qualities similar to the Pride Rock royalty, but his upbringing in the Outlands initially channeled these tendencies toward aggression rather than protective leadership. His transformation isn't just character development, it's the full realization of genetic potential when placed in the appropriate environmental context. The most scientifically fascinating aspect is the parallel development of Kovu and Simba. Despite their different origins, they follow remarkably similar developmental trajectories, once Kovu enters an environment similar to Simba's. This suggests that given the right environmental conditions, the royal gene expresses in predictable patterns regardless of lineage. In genetic terms, what we're witnessing is phenotypic plasticity, the ability of a single genotype to produce different phenotypes depending on environmental conditions. Kovu's genetic potential remains constant, but its expression changes dramatically based on his environment. This brings us to the most profound implication of our genetic theory. If leadership qualities in the Pride Lands have genetic foundations, and these genes can express in various lineages under the right conditions, then the entire succession narrative takes on new meaning. It's not just about birthright or tradition, it's about the expression of genetic potential for leadership. This suggests that the Pride Lands' prosperity is linked to having rulers who express the optimal genetic profile for current environmental conditions. The succession of different phenotypes, golden, dark, and now balanced, may represent adaptive responses to changing environmental challenges. As we look toward the final part of our theory, a profound question emerges. If genetic factors influence leadership qualities in the Pride Lands, what does this tell us about the future of the lineage? Is there a genetic destiny unfolding across generations? And can understanding these patterns help us predict what comes next for Pride Rock? Having traced the royal gene through multiple generations and phenotypic expressions, we now arrive at the most profound implication of our genetic theory, the concept of genetic destiny in the Pride Lands. What if the entire Lion King narrative isn't just about individual choices and moral lessons, but about the unfolding of genetic imperatives across generations? When we synthesize all the scientific evidence we've examined, a remarkable pattern emerges. The royal lineage doesn't just pass down physical traits, it follows a predictable cycle of genetic expressions that correlate with specific leadership qualities and pride challenges. Let's examine this genetic cycle with scientific precision. The golden phenotype, Mufasa Simba, emerges during periods of environmental stability and abundance, displaying leadership qualities optimized for maintaining established order. The darker phenotype, Scar, emerges during transitional periods, with qualities adapted for navigating scarcity and upheaval. The balanced phenotype, Kovu, represents genetic recombination that incorporates adaptive elements from both. This isn't random. It's consistent with how evolutionary adaptations function in isolated populations. In evolutionary biology, cyclical phenotypic expressions often represent adaptation to changing environmental pressures. The Pride Rock genetic cycle appears to function as an evolutionary strategy, ensuring the lineage maintains genetic diversity necessary for long-term survival. Let me be clear. This doesn't diminish the moral dimensions of the character's choices. Rather, it suggests that genetic factors create predispositions that influence, but don't determine, behavioral outcomes. Think about the concept of genetic potential versus environmental realization. Each expression of the royal gene creates specific potential and predispositions, but environmental factors and individual choices determine how that potential manifests. Mufasa's golden phenotype created potential for protective leadership that was realized through his upbringing and choices. Scar's darker phenotype created different potential that manifested as antagonism due to his environmental context and personal decisions. The scientific concept that best explains this phenomenon is gene-environment interaction, where genetic predispositions interact with environmental conditions to produce behavioral outcomes. This changes everything. The Lions of Pride Rock aren't just making choices, they're navigating the complex interplay between their genetic heritage and environmental circumstances. Let's explore the real-world scientific parallels. In wild lion populations, researchers have documented cyclical emergence of different phenotypes correlated with changing environmental conditions. During periods of abundance, lions with certain genetic profiles thrive. During scarcity, alternative genetic expressions provide adaptive advantages. The Pride Rock lineage appears to maintain genetic diversity that enables adaptation to these changing conditions. Instead of selecting for a single optimal phenotype, the lineage preserves genetic variants that provide adaptive advantages under different circumstances. This represents an evolutionary strategy called balanced polymorphism, where multiple forms of a gene are maintained in a population because each provides advantages in different contexts. The scientific evidence for this genetic preservation is compelling. When we analyze physical characteristics across all generations, we observe what geneticists call phenotypic oscillation, traits that cycle through periods of expression and recession rather than following linear inheritance patterns. This brings us to a profound implication. The genetic health of Pride Rock depends on maintaining diversity in the royal lineage. From an evolutionary perspective, lineages that maintain genetic diversity show greater resilience to environmental changes than those that become genetically homogeneous. The various expressions of the royal gene, golden, dark, and balanced, collectively provide adaptive capacity to face changing challenges. Kovu's emergence represents a critical genetic development, the integration of adaptive traits from different expressions of the royal gene. His balanced phenotype suggests genetic recombination that preserves advantageous elements from both the golden and darker phenotypes. From a biological perspective, this genetic recombination represents evolutionary adaptation in action. When we examine Kovu's physical development in detail, we observe traits associated with both phenotypic expressions of the royal gene. His physical strength and protective instincts echo the golden phenotype, while his strategic thinking and adaptability reflect beneficial aspects of the darker phenotype. This balanced expression isn't coincidental. It represents the next evolutionary adaptation in the Pride Rock lineage, combining advantageous traits from both previous expressions. Consider how this genetic perspective recontextualizes the entire narrative arc. The conflict between Mufasa and Scar isn't just sibling rivalry, it's the tension between different genetic expressions of the royal lineage. Simba's journey isn't just personal growth, it's the realization of genetic potential. Kovu's transformation isn't just character development, it's genetic recombination creating a new adaptive phenotype. From this perspective, the Pride Land's prosperity depends not just on who rules, but on having rulers whose genetic expression is optimally adapted to current environmental challenges. The most scientifically compelling aspect is how precisely these genetic expressions correlate with leadership requirements. During periods of stability, the golden phenotype provides ideal leadership qualities: strength for defense, confidence for maintaining order, and protective instincts for pride welfare. During transitional periods, elements of the darker phenotype offer adaptive advantages: strategic thinking, adaptability to change, and capacity for difficult decisions. The balanced phenotype emerging in Kovu suggests adaptation to new challenges requiring both protection and innovation. Exactly what the Pride Lands need during a period of reconciliation and rebuilding. Let's explore what this means for the genetic future of Pride Rock. If our theory holds true, future generations would likely continue this pattern of adaptive genetic expressions. The offspring of Kiara and Kovu would carry recombined genes from both lineages, potentially expressing new phenotypic variations adapted to future challenges. From an evolutionary perspective, this genetic recombination enhances the lineage's adaptive capacity. Research on lion populations shows that prides with greater genetic diversity show improved resilience to environmental changes, disease resistance, and reproductive success. The profound implication is that Pride Rock's fate isn't just determined by individual rulers, but by the genetic health of its royal lineage. This brings us to what may be the most provocative aspect of our theory, what I call the genetic destiny hypothesis. If leadership qualities are partially encoded in the royal gene, and these expressions follow cyclical patterns, then the succession of rulers isn't just about individual worthiness, but about having the right genetic expression for current pride challenges. This doesn't suggest genetic determinism, that characters have no choice in their fate. Rather, it suggests that genetic factors create predispositions that influence development in concert with environmental factors and personal choices. The royal gene doesn't determine destiny, but it creates potentials and predispositions that shape life trajectories. Let's explore the real-world parallels in evolutionary biology. Studies of leadership hierarchies in animal populations show complex interactions between genetic factors, environmental conditions, and individual behavior. Certain genetic profiles create predispositions toward leadership behaviors, but these are expressed differently depending on environmental contexts. The most fascinating scientific concept relevant to our theory is phenotypic integration. This refers to how multiple traits develop and function together as an integrated whole rather than as isolated characteristics. The royal gene doesn't just influence isolated traits, but creates an integrated phenotype where physical, neurological, and behavioral characteristics develop in concert. This explains why physical traits in the Pride Rock lineage correlate so strongly with leadership qualities. They're different expressions of the same integrated genetic heritage. From this perspective, the entire Lion King narrative takes on new meaning. It's not just a story about individual journey and moral choice, though these elements remain vital. It's also about the unfolding of genetic potential across generations, the evolutionary adaptation of a royal lineage to changing challenges, and the complex interplay between genetic heritage and personal agency. This genetic lens doesn't diminish the narrative's power. It enriches our understanding by adding biological depth to psychological and moral dimensions. The question remains, can the genetic cycle be broken, or is it an inevitable aspect of the Pride Rock lineage? Scientific evidence suggests that while genetic patterns create strong tendencies, they're not immutable. Epigenetic factors can modify gene expression, environment can reshape developmental trajectories, and conscious choice can override genetic predispositions. The balanced phenotype emerging in Kovu suggests evolution of the genetic pattern itself, not breaking the cycle but adapting it to create new possibilities. This brings us to our final scientific insight. Genetic destiny isn't fixed but constantly evolving. The Pride Rock lineage isn't bound to endlessly repeat the same genetic cycle. Rather, through genetic recombination, epigenetic adaptation, and environmental interaction, the royal gene itself evolves, creating new potentials and possibilities for future generations. In this light, the union of Kiara and Kovu represents not just reconciliation between prides, but genetic adaptation creating new evolutionary potential for the royal lineage. As we conclude our genetic analysis, a profound question emerges. If Pride Rock's prosperity depends on maintaining genetic diversity in its royal lineage, what does this tell us about the true meaning of "we are one"? Perhaps this refrain isn't just about social unity, but about biological integration, the recombination of diverse genetic expressions to create a lineage with the adaptive capacity to face whatever challenges the future holds. The genetic destiny of Pride Rock isn't predetermined, but constantly evolving through the complex interplay of heredity, environment, and choice. The royal gene doesn't dictate fate, but creates potential that each generation must navigate. Understanding this genetic dimension doesn't diminish the narrative's moral power. It enriches it by revealing the biological foundations that underlie the struggle between destiny and choice. In the end, the most remarkable aspect of the Pride Rock lineage isn't just its distinctive physical traits or cyclical expressions. It's the ongoing evolutionary adaptation that ensures the lineage's survival across changing conditions. A genetic legacy as enduring as Pride Rock itself. What if the true message of the Lion King isn't just about remembering who you are, but about the endless biological dance between genetic heritage and personal choice that shapes not just individuals, but the destiny of entire lineages?